Okay, welcome to video number 3 in the outrageously short and unacceptably incomplete history of the definitions of economics. Last video I ended with Marshall, and if we remember, Marshall's definition was that economics was the study of ordinary or human beings or man going about the ordinary business of life, and he said that that was focusing on both the individual and the social with respect to the acquisition and use of the material aspects of life. So this was his definition of economics. This is a pretty broad definition. Now, this was put forward in 1890 in his book, The Principles of Economics, which was and is an astoundingly successful book. It was really the first textbook of the 20th century, or became the first textbook of the 20th century for economics. Marshall worked hard in reclassifying economics as economics, not using the term political economy anymore. Nonetheless, even as it was gaining a large degree of success, particularly in Great Britain, and establishing a clear foothold in the United States, there were already critics at work, especially in the United States. And perhaps the most famous and iconoclastic of these was the notorious Thorstein Veblen. So let's have a look at him. There's Thorstein Veblen, the iconoclastic economist come sociologist come anthropologist. Veblen actually came up with the term neoclassical economics, and he meant it as a term of abuse, but those economists who were persuaded by this school of thought actually took up that label and made it their own. So Veblen was not particularly keen on Marshall's conception of economics, largely because he felt that it didn't pay sufficient attention to what we might call the big picture of how the economy evolves historically. You might note from the last lecture I said that Marshall didn't actually deny that this was the case. He just thought that in most cases, most analyses of economic relationships or economic behaviour at any given moment would entail holding constant or assuming away changes in institutional environments, because those changes happened very slowly, so it wasn't really relevant to an analysis unless you were doing a historical kind of analysis. Veblen thought that that's exactly what we should be doing. The economist Walter Hamilton in 1919, one of institutionalism's champions in the United States, and we have to remember that institutionalism as an economic school of thought was a distinctively American phenomenon. Anyway, he put the matter this way: what he thought economics really should be defined as. Institutional economics seeks to explain the nature and extent of order amid economic phenomena, or those concerned with industry in relation to human well-being. Such an explanation cannot properly be answered in formulas explaining the processes through which prices emerge in a market. That's having a dig at neoclassical economics. It cannot stop short of a study of the conventions, customs, habits of thinking, and modes of doing which make up the scheme of arrangements which we call the economic order. It must set forth in their relations one to another the institutions which together comprise the organisation of modern industrial society. So what institutions is he talking about here? He's talking about things like the legal system, governmental structures and bureaucracies, the modern corporation, mass trade unions, and the kinds of particular customs, habits and values that nations might have, such as, for example, Veblen's favourite example was ostentatious consumerism, where one aped the lifestyle of an economic elite. He thought that was a particular kind of habit that had become ingrained as part of American society and other societies as well. And that you couldn't really understand a lot of economic behaviour, production, exchange, consumption, unless you understood the large institutions, the large powerful institutions which shaped the behaviour of people in their economic activities. Now, that's happening in the United States. Meanwhile, back in Great Britain, another influential economist of the early 20th century, Lionel Robbins, later Lord Lionel Robbins, also felt that Marshall's definition of economics wasn't satisfactory. Although, it's not because he agreed with the institutionalists, it was for entirely different reasons. He argued that economics was essentially the study of individuals' choices that must be made because the available resources are scarce, whatever people's preferences happen to be. So he wasn't interested in telling you what you should prefer or what you should like, but rather simply taking as given whatever people liked or whatever people preferred, whatever that might happen to be, then determining what would be the most efficient means of obtaining those preferences. That is, the least costly in terms of the use of resources, which were scarce. So he laid out his new definition of economics in his 1932 book, An Essay on the Nature and Significance of Economic Science. So here's Lionel Robbins. There's his book, his essay on the nature and significance, 1932. Here's his definition. The economist studies the disposal of scarce means. He is interested in the way different degrees of scarcity of different goods give rise to different ratios of valuation between them. And he is interested in the way in which changes in conditions of scarcity, whether coming from changes in ends or changes in means, from the demand side or the supply side, affect these ratios. Economics is the science which studies human behaviour as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. So at this particular point, you might want to pause this video lecture, go to your textbook and see if you can find the remnants of Lionel Robbins' definition of economics scattered through chapter 1, maybe in the beginning and also later on in reference to something called the production possibility frontier. See if you can find the remnants, the fragments of Lionel Robbins' definition of economics there. After you've done that, come back and we'll continue. So, Lionel Robbins' definition of economics was not an immediately popular one in the 1930s when he first cast it. We should remember that the 1930s was the period of the Great Depression, which only came to an end, in the United States at least, with the advent of World War II. The Great Depression, which was characterized by a collapse in production, the destruction of financial wealth, mass unemployment in the world's industrialized economies, turned this phenomenon, this earth-shattering phenomenon, turned economists' minds away from the neoclassical emphasis on particular markets. The market for tea and coffee, and choosing between, should I have more tea or should I have more coffee? I can't have both because I've got limited resources available to me. These sorts of individual choices seemed trivial relative to the functioning of the entire national economy. And this was the moment at which one of the greatest economists of the 20th century, which most people have heard somewhere along the line, John Maynard Keynes, came to the fore. In his magnum opus, the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, published in 1936, John Maynard Keynes divided economics into two realms, or two levels of analysis. The right dichotomy is, I suggest, between the theory of the individual industry or firm and the rewards and the distribution between different uses of a given quantity of resources on the one hand, and the theory of output and employment as a whole on the other hand. So he has this dichotomy between the individual industry or firm and analysing that with given resources available, and on the other hand, thinking about the output or changes in the output and employment level on the whole for the entire economy, not looking at a particular industry or a particular household. Keynes's book compelled economists to realign their attention away from the analysis of individual firms and industries and towards, quote, the forces which determine changes in the scale of output and employment as a whole in the national economy. The realignment was so striking and so effective as to basically reconstitute the definition of what economics meant at the cutting edge. This isn't to say that Keynes completely rejected what went before with Alfred Marshall. In fact, you could argue it's a kind of continuation of that. But because he put such a large emphasis on this output and employment for the nation as a whole, it was effectively a kind of redefinition of what was regarded as cutting-edge thinking. So he writes, I call my theory a general theory. I mean by this that I am chiefly concerned with the behaviour of the economic system as a whole, with aggregate incomes, aggregate profits, aggregate output, aggregate employment, aggregate investment, aggregate savings, rather than with the incomes, profits, output, employment, investment and saving of particular industries, firms or individuals. What I suggest you do now is, again, stop the video, go to chapter 1 of your textbook and see if you can find Keynes's dichotomy that he expresses here in 1936. See if you can find that in your textbook today, that dichotomy that he makes. What do we call it today? He has no names for them, but what does the textbook call this dichotomy? Okay, then come back after you've done that. After the Second World War, efforts were made, especially in the United States, to combine this Keynesian view of aggregate phenomena with neoclassical economics, which was interested in individual firms, individual households, and the decision making in markets between buyers and sellers for particular products. The result is what has been called the neoclassical synthesis, which was championed in the 1950s and 1960s by Paul Samuelson, and there's a picture of the young Paul Samuelson there. Samuelson's influential definition, however, fairly clearly indicates that Keynesian thinking had to conform to neoclassical tenets rather than the other way around. So here's his definition of economics from his first textbook called Economics Creatively. So the definition goes, economics is the study of how people and society end up choosing, with or without the use of money, to employ scarce productive resources that could have alternative uses to produce various commodities over time and distributing them for consumption now or in the future amongst various persons or groups in society. It analyzes costs and benefits of improving patterns of resource allocation. So here we have the notion of scarce resources, which can be used in alternative ways to produce commodities for consumption now or in the future. So now, or saved, you can save for the future, by individuals and groups. And there's an element, an ethical or a normative element in the sense that you can analyze the costs and the benefits of improving patterns of resource allocation. So improving here suggests there's a normative or an ethical presupposition at work. We don't exactly know what he means by improving, but nonetheless there's some kind of ethical dimension to it. Now, the Great Depression wasn't the only event that had a significant effect on how economists thought about economics. So did the post-World War II Cold War, starting in the 1950s. After the great conflagration of World War II, the Cold War standoff between the United States with Western European allies and the Soviet Union gave a new lease of life to Lionel Robbins' original conception of economics. Remember, this was his conception of you attempt to analyze the individual behavior to most efficiently attain the whatever wants or preferences they have given the resources, the scarce resources that are available to them. For some economists, the Cold War was a kind of deadly competitive game played between hyper-rational agents. So for them, economics was essentially a kind of not really about production, consumption, distribution, exchange, or anything like that, of goods and services in markets, how firms and how households could be in some way influenced by government policies to increase output or to decrease pollution or something like that. It wasn't anything about that anymore. It wasn't about the content so much as it was about a way of thinking, a way of analysing any kind of problem at all. So it was rational action by self-interested agents who responded to incentives given the available information and given the resources they had at their disposal. This is really what economics was about, according to this new breed of economists who came along in the Cold War period. Robert Altman, the game theorist, provides a neat example of this kind of thinking when he's discussing, in 2006, he's discussing rational wars. So there's Robert Altman, and he writes, "Can one sum up economics in one word? Yes, the word is incentives. Economics is all about incentives. An economy is a game. The incentives of the players interact in complex ways and lead to surprising, often counterintuitive results. As it turns out, the economy really works that way." So this is an interesting kind of perspective, but what he's trying to get at here is the idea that economics isn't so much tied to certain phenomena that exist in the world anymore, as its meaning is tied to a way of thinking. It's tied to rational decision making. Given the constraints that one faces, how does one most efficiently obtain one's goals? That's how some economists now think of economics. Incidentally, you might want to pause the video now, have a look in your textbook, look in the index for the term game theory, and then go to that section of the textbook which discusses game theory. Just read the first paragraph of that, and then go and have a look at the box in the section on game theory titled The Prisoner's Dilemma. This gives you an idea of what a practical example of, it's not really a practical example, but an example of game theory in operation. And you can see how this particular example is not really tied to what the classical political economists would have thought of as economics per se, or even Alfred Marshall would have thought of as economics. It's moved outside of its traditional domain, is now just thinking about rational decision making and how it can lead to, as Robert Altman says, counterintuitive results. Anyway, what can we make of all of this? We've just gone through this, what effectively amounts to a kind of whirlwind history of the definitions of economics. Can we now say what the true or correct definition of economics is? I think that what we've established is that there are actually many definitions that have evolved over time. And something curious about this is that although the last of these, the most recent of these, where economics is a way of thought, it's a way of thinking about any kind of problem at all, where you weigh up the costs and the benefits of any kind of activity in order to obtain the most efficient outcome, although that is the most recent one, it's still not the only one, because the other definitions, although they are older, it doesn't mean that they're dead. In economics, it's very rare for an idea to die off completely. It always hangs around in some form or other. So the other definitions can't really be dismissed as, oh, well, they're gone and dead now, because they're not. There are economists who utilize those definitions and who argue that these other definitions, are superior to, well, all of the others that they don't accept. Perhaps all we can really say is that economics simply doesn't have a single definition. And that's a fairly basic but difficult truth for a lot of people to handle. We like to think that it has one meaning, when in fact it doesn't. I think it has many meanings and they compete with each other. Economics can mean the production, distribution and consumption of goods. It can mean that topic. It can mean how economic classes struggle with each other over their shares of national income, and how this struggle influences the fortunes of the entire politico-economic system. It can also mean how individuals maximise their own utility in making their choices over consumption, work and leisure, for example. It can also be about how to most efficiently utilise the available resources in order to try and maximise the level of happiness or satisfaction or well-being, whatever those terms mean, for the society as a whole. You could say that's what economics is really about as well. It can be about how to increase output and income per capita to achieve or maintain full employment, prevent hyperinflation, to prevent deflation, to achieve some measure of economic stability and improvement in people's standards, material standards of living, as for a nation as a whole. All of these definitions are possible. We could go with the institutionalist definition as well, where that's about how powerful social, legal and political institutions and customs shape the historical evolution of the economic structure of a society as a whole. That's a legitimate definition of economics as well. So, and I think you could find various ways of combining them. I mean, you can't combine all of them together in a kind of giant stew, because there are elements there which are clearly incompatible with each other. But it doesn't mean that you have to reject all of them bar one. You can combine them in various ways, I think, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. And there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that other people might have different definitions. So, I think as a final point though, you have to be aware that when someone says the definition of economics is X, they're not telling you the full story. And then you have to ask yourself, why aren't they telling me the full story? Sometimes there's a conscious agenda behind that. Sometimes there's an unconscious agenda. The person who is giving you a definition isn't themselves necessarily fully aware of the economic or political implications of giving you a particular kind of definition. So always be careful when someone says the definition of X is Y. There's usually more to the story than seems to be the case on the surface. Okay, that'll do for now. There's no part 4, so now you can have a little sleep.